Hello, my name is Brisha Rodriguez, and I did my TED Talk on medical marijuana and opioids. Marijuana, weed, dope. It's actually known by so many names, but there's actually nothing known about the abilities of it, especially medically. In the Compassionate Use Act of 1996, California became the first state to allow the use of medical marijuana for people with severe illnesses, and this was only the beginning for legalization. Many other states continue to fall in line, and now in 2020, 33 states allow for the medical use of marijuana, and 11 of those allow for the recreational use, if you're over 21, of course. This map shows the United States and which states allow for the recreational and medical use of marijuana. The light green ones only allow for medical use, but the dark green ones allow for recreational and medical use. A study was done on patients with fibromyalgia, and they looked at the different types of drugs and the effectiveness of it. If you look at this graph, you can see that medical marijuana was by far the most effective. Now, you may be wondering, why isn't medical marijuana more popular? Well, it's kind of due to one big factor. Opioids. These tiny little pills have actually caused a huge problem in the United States. In a TED Talk by Mara Gordon, she shared her experience with using opioids and how it was terrible on her, how she was taking up to 26 pills in one day. She eventually found medical marijuana and it changed her life. She actually stopped using opioids altogether due to medical marijuana. After watching this TED Talk, a question kept popping in my head. Can medical marijuana help fix the opioid crisis in the United States? Now, if you didn't know, there's a huge problem with opioids in the US. To see why it happened, we have to backtrack to the beginning. In the early 1990s, pharmaceutical companies stated that the painkillers they were prescribing would not be addicting and therefore be less harmful to people they're prescribing them to. This caused many doctors to start prescribing them at a high rate, which eventually led to the overuse and misuse of these drugs. In 2017, the U.S. Department of Human Health and Services declared the opioid crisis a public health emergency. Here are just a few statistics about the opioid epidemic. If you can't tell, it's very harmful to the people of the United States. For example, 130 people die every single day from opioid-related overdoses. Approximately 450,000 people have died from opioid overdose between 1999 and 2018. That's an insane amount of people, and most people began as patients who just were looking help for their pain and either ended up addicted, searching for alternatives to the drug, or even just abusing their own prescription. After hearing these facts, you're probably curious on why doctors are still prescribing these drugs. It's actually because of the lack of access and knowledge on marijuana. About only 1% of doctors are actually qualified to prescribe marijuana to patients, which makes it extremely difficult to get. Since barely any doctors are qualified to prescribe it, this means that there would need to be an extreme amount of communication between doctor and doctor. This allows for miscommunication between people, which can be harmful to the patient. This also means that the doctor who would be prescribing the marijuana needs to know the full medical history of the patient, which is difficult when they haven't been in contact with each other consistently like the patient's main doctor. There has been so many studies done on the use of opioids and marijuana, and mostly all show either a decrease in opioid use or getting rid of them altogether when you introduce medical marijuana. If you look at this graph, you can see the states who legalize marijuana end up with less patients prescribed opioids. This can be for many reasons, but the connection can be made. In Potential Impact of Medical Marijuana on Non-Medical Opioid Use by Farrell and Schlesinger, it talks about how the introduction of medical marijuana has effects on other parts of medical issues. From this article, it shows that with the increase of medical marijuana leads to a decrease in opioid use, and even a fourth decrease of the rates of opioid overdoses. Now, it also says not to assume these are related, but there's more evidence to back this connection up. In Legalization of Medical Marijuana and Incidence of Opioid Mortality by Hayes and Brown, they prove that opioid deaths have decreased since more medical marijuana laws have been passed. The reason this is because cannabis connects to the cannabinoid receptors in your brain, which blocks pain receptors. Opioids and cannabis help with stress and increase dopamine, so they do similar things to the body. Marijuana is just less addictive than these opioids. The main issue with medical marijuana is that there's not much known about it. Marijuana can't be dosed like other medicine, and in fact, from 75 different marijuana products from 3 different cities, only 17% of them had accurate labels about the amount of THC in them, which makes it kind of scary. Without the accuracy and the ability to dose, how would one substitute opioids for marijuana and know that it'll have the same or even better effects? This causes a lot of people to be unsure and scared about using medical marijuana. Due to the uncertainty, medical marijuana is hard to access. Like I said before, only about 1% of doctors are legally allowed to prescribe marijuana. In some states, you have to fail another form of pain therapy before you can even be considered for marijuana. In the early 1960s, opioids were pushed as a way to control chronic pain, and a lot of doctors are still on that path. Many doctors are convinced that marijuana will lead to death, debauchery, or hopeless insanity, as stated in Why Doctors Love Opioids and Hate Marijuana for Chronic Pain by Claw, which has been proven false for short-term use, but long-term use of medical marijuana has very little data to support for or against it, considering it's still pretty new. This makes doctors less eager to prescribe it. Many doctors don't want another crisis like the opioid crisis to appear with a different drug, so they're being very careful with the distribution of it. As the opioid crisis in the United States, recreational and prescribed, continues to get worse and worse, people should be focused on changing the cause of this, not just fixing the effect. The main problem with the opioid crisis is opioids. Opioid addiction rewires someone's brain where they feel like they need to be on the drug to be normal. People who are prescribed opioids can even turn to street drugs like heroin to feel the same numbness from opioids, because opioid tolerance can grow at an extreme rate. Cannabis, on the other hand, is way less addictive, and there's one huge plus to it. Nobody has ever died from marijuana overdose. The worst things people have reported is just getting too high. The benefits from cannabis are already slightly being shown in the medical field. Patients have reported using less opioids or even dropping them completely when giving access to medical marijuana. People even say it gives them control over their illness because they can control their own dose, how often they need to take it, and the timing of it. Overall, there needs to be more research done on medical marijuana, but I think that introducing medical marijuana more for the public will actually have a positive benefit and make the opioid crisis die down. Just because less doctors would be prescribing opioids and more would be prescribing medical marijuana for pain, making them less common and less likely to have high overdose rates. In a literature review by LeBaron et al., they came to a conclusion that an increase in medical marijuana can lead to less opioid use, less hospitalizations for problems with opioids, fewer overdoses from opioids, and in the end, less money spent on taking care of the opioid crisis, since people care about money more than anything. Overall, I believe that with an increase in medical marijuana use, there will be a decrease in opioid prescriptions, which will eventually lead to the decrease in opioid overdoses, and which will eventually let the opioid crisis die down. Thank you, and here is my citations.